they want to pay for convenience. And you know what's annoying? Stitching together a bunch of that you could.
What would you say are the key shifts that you've seen in the 10 years that you've been doing this?
They're a lot smarter than they used to be. Like, to build a proper community is not just like releasing the best, code and features. Most businesses and startups kind of fail out there. Open source may help a little bit, but there's no guarantee.
Hey, Chris, how's it going, man?
Hey, good to catch up.
Yeah. What have you been up to recently?
Oh, well, let's.
Sounds like there's never any drama in your world,
no,
right?
no, for sure. I mean, obviously, a few weeks ago we just got done hosting KubeCon, London,
amazing.
which was fun with over 12,000 people. So biggest kind of open source conference in Europe, for sure. And then I ended up getting the flu after that, which was not so great. But hey, that's the downside
the Kubu flu.
Yeah, that's the downside of working with the community. Sometimes you get a little conference cough flu. That's been around. Last 48 hours or so have been a little bit interesting for me because we had this fun incident in the CNCF community where we had a original vendor that wanted to claw back kind of the rights, the IP for their project and kind of relicense things under a non-open source license called the business source license. So, we call it the proverbial rug pull. That's kind of been so common with, Terraform, OpenTofu, Valkey, Redis, OpenSearch a lot. Like there's a lot of these kind of examples. Well, not too many, but like enough that have happened. Right. And it was just a little bit surprising, to kind of have this happen in the CN or an attempt to happen in the CNCF community. So we kind of have to do our best to preserve the rights that we have for the project and kind of protect the community. In this case.
How do you navigate those kinds of situations? I mean, obviously you don't have to go into details for this specific situation, but generally when these kinds of issues kind of crop up, like what's your approach?
I think, first step is always to have hopefully a logical conversation with all the parties kind of involved and talk about, what the IP process is, what the rights, associated that projects have, the trademark rules, privacy policy, like all the intellectual property regime that projects are rolled under in open source foundation. So we kind of have that kind of discussion and then like here are what options you could have. Because, look, I'm very sympathetic to folks that are trying to build a business on open source software. It's not always, easy, right? Like it's not everyone can be Red Hat. It's difficult, right? So, and we've had other cases in CNCF where we had, business priorities changed. For example, Grafana is a fairly well-known, open source focused observability company. They just decided one day like, hey, we're going to go pull our maintainers that worked on Cortex, a CNCF project, and we're going to go fork it, put it under a new name, Amir, and we're going to move those folks and basically productize that under the AGPL, which, they have the right to do. One of the preeminent, rights in open source projects, especially Apache 2 license things, is the right to fork. And they went and did that.
Yeah.
They had a great conversations with us. We're like, that sucks. We did a call to add new maintainers to the project. I think we had Amazon and Red Hat at least step up. So like all good. Both projects kind of coexist, happily. We had an adult conversation. This didn't happen, unfortunately, in this case where we tried to say like, hey, there's options, there's plenty of things you could do, but they kind of decided to try to claw back certain things. And so, I don't want to, like no reason to kind of beat around, but like, you basically what happens is like, have like lawyers, involved dealing with kind of, IP issues, which is fine. That the lawyers will sort it out, and we'll do our damnedest to ensure the integrity of the open source project community for CNCF. But hey, another day in the life of open source foundation.
I was going to say it's never boring, right? It kind of I found this kind of interesting recently about over the years how to build a business around open source. It's kind of has shifted and adjusted in so many different ways.
Yep.
Like I'm sure you remember, like back in the early days, everyone was just trying models just to see what would work. From like selling software in boxes to merchandise to dual licensing and things like that.
Totally.
When if someone was to walk in right now and say like, okay, I want to build a business, I want to build like a real open source project. Like I don't just want to put code online so I can get the credit of being open source, but I actually want to build a real business around this. What would you recommend to them? Like, what do you think is, especially when we talk about things like open core, what do you think is the right way to build a business while also building the kind of project that would thrive in a place like the CNCF.
Yeah, I think, let's say every case is going to be a little bit, different. I think at the end of the day, whatever you build has to deliver some form of value to, your customers, right? Whether, you're
Right.
buying it because they're improving the developer efficiency, or you SaaSified an existing open source project that was hard to use and you're providing security updates and support. So there's a lot of
Yeah,
different
yeah.
models to say. One thing that I explain to folks is when they kind of do this, they have this vision of like, hey, we're going to open source things. All these people are going to use it, give us feedback. They're going to turn into customers. And that doesn't really happen because, essentially what happens is the open source community that is using your project and giving you feedback is very different potentially than the end customer of maybe a product that you're building on
Right,
that.
for
And
sure.
usually the saying, I'm trying to remember maybe who originally coined this. Maybe I'll give credit to Stephen Wally, who's kind of an old open source, let's call him a fellow now, does some teaching, at a
Yep.
university. But he always had this like, it's like the people in your communities, open source communities, they got a lot of time. They got a lot of time to give you feedback, but like they don't got money, right? They
Yeah. Yeah,
so
yeah, yeah.
that's the problem there. The people, your product folks, that your target customer, you want to go after those. Those are the folks that got money, not a lot of time, right? And that kind
Yeah.
of differentiation between project and product is kind of the core issue, and people have to see these things as different things. Like it gets very confusing when you kind of think of, if you go back to the early days with like Docker, it's like, well, do you mean like Docker the open source project, Docker the container runtime, Docker the product, Docker desktop,
Yeah.
Docker the company? These different things are different. A company, a project, product are different. And I think names inherently have a value proposition to them, that if you don't have them separate, you kind of do a disservice to yourself in blending
Yeah.
all those. And everyone's done this a little bit different. I'll give credit to Red Hat a long time ago when they kind of did this, like, RHEL versus Fedora. Fedora is where all the crazy innovation happens, and we
Yeah.
will take from it. And then RHEL is our enterprise thing, and they are different brands, even though they're based on a similar core. And I think that just helps to have conversations with folks at the end of the
It's
day.
interesting you say that. I was sat next to Adam Jacobs going to KubeCon, not in London, but the last one. And one of the things that he was talking about was, the way in which, for example, Red Hat and Canonical approach this were very different, right? Like, so, his argument was, if you look at Ubuntu, there's a lot of kind of emotional attachment to Ubuntu. There's a lot of like raw passion around Ubuntu
Yep,
from a community
totally.
perspective. But Canonical's really struggled much more to build a solid business around it, because at the end of the day, you've got to kind of draw the parallel between the business and the community to some reasonable extent, and that's kind of what Red Hat did, right? And his other example was like Docker Desktop as well, right? And so, and I often think that maybe the distinction here is that when you're building a product, you've got to find product market fit, and your
Yep.
economic buyer is going to be very different to the user of the product, right?
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
then of course in open source communities, of which CNCF is one community, there's many other communities out there. The dynamics of like a company just rapidly iterating on their product when they're running the code is very different to facilitating and running a real open source project, as opposed to just dumping code online.
Yep.
How do you think about like that balance between how you iterate and find product market fit while also serving the community in the way that we would define as a real
Yeah, I
project?
think it's hard to say. I think from an open source project perspective, the rapid innovation cycle you have in open source, where you're constantly, shipping things, people calling your baby slash project ugly, like you're getting feedback all across the board, and maybe some of that feedback turns into something that actually may, have product, market, fit to an
Yeah.
audience, right? If you're not, if you're just doing that on the product side, you're basically kind of going the traditional route of like, all right, I'm going to have some like design partners, right? What is my ICP, or perfect customer, it's a lot of a slower process to kind of get to that product market fit, where I kind of find, the you could use your open source community almost like a modern customer advisory board to help you get to that product market
Right.
fit faster. You just kind of have to think that way versus assume that like everything that they give you may be that product market fit. Like, they're going to give you all sorts of ideas, potentially help out, and so
Yep.
on. So as long as you kind of have that mindset, it helps. But every piece of software is different, right? If you're building like a database, right? Most people don't want to run their own database by themselves, right? The people will happily pay a cloud or a SaaS vendor to kind of take care of it, right? It's versus like maybe let's call it like a service mesh, maybe a little bit different. Maybe people are more comfortable running that. Like everything's going to be a little bit different. I think
Yeah, yeah,
at
yeah.
the day, there's no like clear crystal solution for turning an open source project into product. And honestly, like sometimes there may not be ideal product market fit, right? Like just like all startups don't survive, not all open source projects will survive, either, right? Sometimes they're just
Yeah.
not fit, for this in terms of a
You,
business model.
I was just thinking, it seems to me as well that like when we look at the pattern around where open source projects succeed, that it makes me think a little bit about kind of like the reason why arguably the Linux desktop, I mean, I'm going to get people are going to hate me for saying this, that the desktop has really not succeeded in the broader sense of the word.
Yeah.
Uh, so bring it on, haters.
Yeah.
But and it's kind of, I think we're better in the position where we're in today than we were in many ways 15 years ago, because I think there was some attempts in some ways to kind of like bastardize the Linux desktop into something that it wasn't. And now it's like, this is a thing for enthusiasts. This is a thing that developers love. But I think it seems to me that one of the reasons why it struggled was because with the Linux desktop, you've got to build like a cohesive experience. And where people would try and separate, like differentiate, we had this with Unity
Yep.
at Canonical.
Yep.
It became much harder. Whereas when we look at the projects, and I would say like Cloud Native is a good example of this, where these are like Lego pieces that it's almost like the Unix philosophy, right? Like you do one thing, you do it really well, and then you can glue all of these Lego bricks together. Do you think that do you think that's the key to success here? Like, do you feel like you could really genuinely build like a singular business and open source project at the same time? Or do you think it has to be open source components that then are fed into a product that the company is driving? Because I don't know.
It's tricky, right? Like, yeah, I think it's easier to do the stitching together a bunch of things and ensuring it
Right.
properly works well, good user experience, everything is secure versus just one specific
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
thing. Because people at the end of the day, like they want to pay for convenience, and like, what's annoying? Stitching together a bunch of shit that you could, get from random open source places and making sure it's all up to date. Like it's just people don't want to. They may do that in the beginning to be like, all right, it's free, I could go do this, and they're like, wait a minute, this is pretty annoying. I will just go happily pay someone to kind of manage this.
Yeah.
This pain, for me, at the end of the day, and like we are seeing vendors do this in some interesting ways. Like if you kind of look at some of these either larger observability vendors or DevOps vendors, so I'm thinking like a Datadog, right? Like they got everything, right? Like you want to observe things, great. Feature flagging, we got that too. FinOps, great. And
Yeah.
you look at like Harness, which another example, like started out mostly CI/CD focused, and I think they're doing feature flag. You're doing like they're and they're essentially all they're doing is collecting a bunch of open source projects, probably best of breed out there, putting it in their ecosystem and trying to go land and expand basically from their existing.
Yeah.
Very, very common thing that kind of
Yeah.
happens
Yeah.
across the board.
When you think about, because I mean, you started working with the CNCF,
It's about
it's like
10 years.
10
Yeah,
years
it's
ago,
about
right?
10 years ago. It's our 10-year anniversary this year, I think. Technically it was
Right.
hired, yeah, about almost 10 years ago. Yeah, it's been a while.
How would you say that kind of, like, if you were to summarize like the areas where you've seen big shifts when it comes to not only like how people build open source, but also just that balance between, because I mean, obviously like the majority of the members in the CNCF they're companies, they're making money, they have to make money. This has to be an investment. It's not just a cost center, right? What would you say are the key shifts that you've seen in the 10 years that you've been doing this?
Well, I say this with maybe the kindest words is like, I think end user companies, banks, like typical big enterprises, they're a lot smarter than they used to be. Like they're not just like, you know what? Here's my latest Gartner or analyst report, and I'm gonna go just buy shit off in the top right corner or whatever. And then like they're a lot smarter now, where they're like, you know what? I like open source in some way because it's kind of like a modern customer advisory board where like there's a bunch of other
Yep.
people there. I get to give feedback in the open, and since in the open they tend to respond faster to me because I'm from some big bank. And open source foundations, well, look at this. Some of them are great. They give me like 5 different service meshes that compete, and I get to kind of, potentially choose the best one, right? That competition is good because they feel like they're not necessarily locked in or screwed. We've had multiple evolutions in, CNCF where this competition has resulted into better, software. We had the whole Docker, rocket wars and, container D kind of, won out. We've had different evolutions of kind of the, let's call it GitOps space where, Flux, great project in many ways. And Argo eventually kind of came around as another offering and kind of offered a little bit, a different approach, a better kind of user experience at getting started, and kind of took a good chunk of the market. Like end users like that. Like I have conversations
Yeah.
with, let's call it a big nameless bank out of New York City that, has brought more of their engineering and infrastructure in house. Is the first thing they do when they're looking to evaluate, a new part of redoing their infrastructure, they bring up that lovely cloud native landscape that people love and hate because they're like, oh my gosh, there's so many things on this landscape
Yeah.
on l.cncf.io. But that's the reality of the market. They're
Yep.
upteen, networking and storage, solutions, and they kind of look at it like, hey, if there's something in CNCF, we'll look at it, we'll play with it, we'll also see what's the proprietary stuff, and they kind of just look at that and help evolve. They view the foundation working in the interests of them, which to me is a very marked change from a long time ago or 10 years ago. Most of these companies were still very, very new to open source, didn't really maybe understand the benefit of open source or the foundations outside of just free. Now they're a little bit
Yeah.
smarter where they're just like, hey, we'd like to go push things here to enable, actual optionality and choice. A lot of them are
Yeah. Yeah.
just
Yeah.
like, hey, CNCF's great. It allowed multi-cloud options for some of my software, so I can now yank both. Maybe I was an Amazon customer and I got a little Azure or two, and I could go set them against each other to get better deals. So that level of
Yeah.
education for enterprises has increased significantly from when I started. And even some of these enterprises, the ones that are a little bit um let's call it ahead of the curve in terms of understanding to build certain things in house, have started to share these things. Like some of our biggest projects in CNCF, Argo, came from the TurboTax company, Intuit, right? Like
Right.
it's
Yeah. Into it. Yeah.
it came from them, right? And it's like they're not necessarily a vendor. There's like they build tax software, right? And they shared what they did, and they've benefited greatly by people jumping in and helping them build this. Spotify completely changed the
I
whole
was gonna. Yeah, with
with
backstage. Yeah.
backstage, right? So these companies now realize like, hey, some of the stuff we build in house, or something that we need, like we can potentially share this with the world and get a bunch of people to help. So like that a long time ago wouldn't happen. Most stuff just came out of like Red Hat, a vendor, a big cloud, right?
Yeah.
So
It
that's
was
the
a much
other market.
narrower like ecosystem, right?
Yeah,
Like the thing I find especially crazy about this is the financial services folks. Like you would imagine in such a highly regulated industry that it would just not be even comprehensible, the idea of consuming open source, let alone
yeah,
contributing to open
yeah.
source.
It's
What do
wild.
you think? What do you think shifted? I mean, look, we all love Gabriel
Yeah,
Colombo.
he's
Like
great. Yeah.
he's the most legendary Italian of all. But like, what do you think led to that? Like, how did that shift? I mean, do you think it's just like a small set of like hard-working people just banging their heads against the wall for
A
years to
little
kind
bit.
of
I mean,
start this
I,
movement?
I think if you could go back in time, it was like really the folks that brought Linux to Wall Street to kind of
Right.
replace a lot of the let's call it mainframe or whatever crazy dependencies had, because they saw it as a way to simply get a cheaper, better system that they could innovate on faster. I think a lot of that, and also in the financial industry, it's there's certain things. What do you generally compete on? I would say like probably like customer service, user experience. As long as my thing is as long as my bank makes it easy not to talk to someone, I'm a pretty happy customer. If I can do everything online, all the back office stuff like the regulatory compliance related stuff that they do, I don't think that's a competitive advantage, right? And so being able to share some of that software, if you kind of look at the organization
Right.
that Gab runs, the FinTech Open Source, Foundation, they have an incredible, like, it's basically on stuff that is not like just, it's not differentiated for them. Like, hey, let's go work on this. This is basically commodity for us. We're going to make our value elsewhere, and that's happening in a lot of industries, right? The whole Academy Software
Yeah.
Foundation with the film industry realizing like they don't need to go create all these like custom explosion algorithms, like color palette technology, like they're all sharing this stuff because it's not
Yeah.
differentiating value for them. What's differentiating is like story, narrative, art, not necessarily the tools needed to create
Yeah. Yeah.
those.
Yeah. Yeah. It is wild to me. Like I remember Gab was a client of mine years
Yep.
ago when they were the Symphony Software
Oh yeah. Yep.
Foundation, which was kind of interesting because there was this open source foundation with a primary stakeholder that really wasn't particularly interested in open source at all.
Yep.
And you have this like Italian guy who's very loud and
Yeah. Yeah.
bombastic, and I remember flying out to New York with Gab one time and met and he was meeting with his board and just looking at the relationship between his board and him. And it not what I would have ever expected. Like you've got this like really like vibrant, bombastic guy who's
Yeah.
like leading this thing, and then you've got an unbelievably passionate board who are focused on open
Yeah.
source. And a lot of the common discussion was the same. It's like everyone's just kind of like eking away in their respective organizations, like pushing it, and everyone's making gradual progress within their organizations. But there's this aggregation of like the industries moving forward with this as well. And like you said, it was primarily like, why are we invested? Why are we building or spending a ton of money on these things
Yeah.
when they don't add value to the business? Do you think that's like the main way in which companies should think about where they build open source and contribute to it? It's like to focus on the things where you want to kind of reduce cost. Do you think that's the primary in
I
which
mean,
people should look at it?
that's an easy way to do it, especially if you're trying to justify it up the management chain for sure. Like, hey, doing this is gonna save us, money or make us more efficient is a pretty easy, sell versus, hey, we're contributing this from the goodness, of our heart. We love this project.
Yeah.
It's great. We it's Ubuntu's great. Like we're gonna just contribute it because we feel good about it. It's not gonna work, practically. So I think having actually
Yeah.
the value associated with contribution goes a long way for sure.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. What do you taking a
Yeah.
step back? Like again, going back to what you've learned over the last 10 years. What do you think are the fundamental? Like, what do you think differentiates the projects that really pop? Like, because there are many projects within the
Yeah.
CNCF,
Yeah.
and some of them are like
Yeah.
super high
Yeah.
profile with a lot
Yeah.
of activity, and some of them aren't like that.
Yeah.
But
Um,
what's the magic
I will
sauce?
say, to consistently, I would say, projects that understand that community doesn't come for free, and
Yeah,
you just can't do the best engineering work only, right? You need to have your team staffed appropriately to do some of that community magic. Like, to build a proper community is not just like releasing the best, code and features. It's like uh, getting feedback from your community, doing open meetings, a lot of kind of project management functions, making sure your documentation is solid. So there's a lot of non-code related things which kind of help build your community. That's kind of what I've seen. Like if you kind of look at the Kubernetes community, great
mm,
example there of like they set values initially. They had a lot of kind of community management, program management, help to kind of get them there, right? They always saw that like, hey, oh, if like, a new cloud provider or a new company like is getting involved in the project, they saw that dynamic as a positive something and not like a zero sum thing where like, oh crap, this new organization's coming in, they're going to go steal more from the pie than versus like, hey, this is going to grow the pie. So positive sum thinking and also hiring folks, to kind of help things on the periphery, making sure your documentation great, examples, talking to people. These things are key. Having time to mentor new folks in the community. You may have fantastic developers and engineers, but if there's not time allotted to help them bring on and onboard and new folks through either mentorships or, whatever internships call it,
Yeah.
then don't be surprised in like 5 years if it's just your company still doing this, even if you have an amazing project, right? That kind of community building stuff doesn't come for free. You really have to invest in it. And you kind of look at the call it examples in CNCF, Kubernetes, OpenTelemetry, Backstage, Argo.
Yeah.
They've all done this type of work and investment in my opinion. It's like it's not guaranteed, but it's definitely part of a good formula to ensuring success.
Yeah, it seems like I think we've seen this with some of the companies that we've talked to as prospects, and then usually haven't come on as customers. Which is, some people will see open source as, oh, this is a great marketing play. If we can be seen as open source, then that's going to open up our sales funnel. It's like, this is bullshit. Like, this is not the way it should be, right? So, but I also sympathize with understanding what's involved in doing that, right? Is from a if somebody's less familiar with the open source world, they know the value, they know what the CNCF is, they know the value of these projects, but then they're like, okay, well, how long is this particular piece of string? If they don't know that, then I guess it can kind of go either way. It seems like understanding this is you kind of got to experience it before you're ready to invest in it.
Yeah,
Right?
or hire expertise or
Right.
someone that's kind of gone through this
Yeah.
for sure. And another good pattern I've seen is companies that will have, if they're building a product on this stuff, having their product management, org leader person also heavily involved in the open source side. So at least there's kind of a bridge between those things, helps
Right.
quite a bit. If they're completely separate, doesn't generally work out well. There'll be kind of dynamics that, let's call it just like communication breakdown, and
Yeah.
it's not healthy. So that's another kind of pattern that I've seen that works pretty well.
Is this
Go ahead.
is this something, Chris, that you think can be learned? Because it seems to me like fundamentally at the top, right? If you've got like a founder or a co-founder, and they look at open source as this is a marketing function. Like we've built this project, we're going to open source this project, we're going to put it out there. No one else is likely to contribute this. We don't really care about. We actually probably don't want other companies contributing to this. We want to control this, but we want to build like a big thriving movement around this open source project. It seems to me like that is a fundamental shift in perception for that leader. Is that something from your experience you think can be taught? Like,
Yeah,
are they coachable to
I
that? Do you think?
think it can be. At the end of the day, you're building a product that inherently has value to whoever your customer is, and there's different ways to go build that, right? Like, one
Yeah,
advantage
yeah,
of open source in some ways is, or open core as an example is like, let's go look at HashiCorp, right? There was like kind of a core bit of Terraform that was, open source at the time and very kind of tightly controlled, but all the extensions and plugins, less so, right? Their community did most of the work for that project. They wrote,
yeah,
modules for everything that exists out there. And if you kind of have that dynamic where you kind of have like a plugin model or system, that is a perfect kind of open source play where the core is either tightly controlled, whether it's proprietary or not, and then you have this huge I call it like almost open edge thing where your edge is open and you have people contribute. You don't you may take a subset of that edge and say like, this is the stuff that's really good. Like, it just gives you a lot of
yeah.
optionality, and I think that that's like a common community pattern, maybe for a lack of, or maybe even almost like a model of how to like build an open source,
Yeah.
business without like open sourcing the whole caboodle. So
Yeah.
some of the stuff I think could
Is
be learned and taught, but it's going to depend on the project and potentially the product. And like not everything will also succeed because, it could be market timing, right? Maybe you were too early, maybe, there was a recession, like nothing's guaranteed, right? And so sometimes it kind of, I talk to folks and they kind of just get upset where they think, hey, if I just like open source something and build a business, like there's a chance that things are going to work out. And it's I'm like, just like any business, like most businesses and startups kind of fail out there. Open source may help a little bit, but there's no guarantee that your
Yeah,
project
for
will be
sure.
successful. And in open source, which is like a naturally a commoditization engine, is like people are going to compete, right? They're going to go look at your stuff, poke at things, and potentially steal ideas. Like that's just the way it works, right? So you kind of have to really be
Yeah.
on top of your game, and toes, which is actually a good thing. Like I think that competition actually helps build better product.
I agree. I think it makes it way better. It strikes me as well that a big chunk of this is then knowing how to kind of navigate that. Like if you open source a project, it's like how you navigate that. Because one of the things I've seen, which I think can be really problematic, is when company open sources an open source project. They're building an open core business, so they got their enterprise version or whatever, and then they get a little bit of success at the beginning, right? They start getting some people they don't know contributing code to the project. It's good code. They start landing it. They're like, holy shit, this is happening, right? And then they keep doubling, and then they double down and double down. And then what happens is, and I think we, to a certain degree, had a little bit of this with a Canonical with Ubuntu, was that so much was given away that it was actually then very difficult to build a business around it, because at some point you've got to not give something away to build an open core company. What do you think is like, what if again, if there was like a founder sat with us right now, what would you say to them around like navigating that balance between thriving project but holding enough back and then setting those expectations with the community, in
I think
and
being
not pissing the community
I
off,
think being transparent with your intentions in the most upfront way is to go. Like
right,
I think the open source community is very unforgiving where they feel like you misled them, rug pulled
pull
them,
the
or a
fast
lot.
one,
Yeah, like,
yeah,
but
yeah,
I admire Sid from GitLab a lot, which has kind of navigated a very kind of tricky thing. It's like, they're competing with GitHub and all this other, stuff out there. In the beginning, they've early had these kind of, they call them, I think, like the stewardship principles, where they're like, all right, we're here to build a business and make money. Here are certain things that we'll consider like enterprise features. Here are things that we won't. Like, they just outline their whole thought process and just kind of make
yeah,
that public. I think that just helps because at least, there's a conversation, out there. The community kind of knows that like, hey, this is not something that's like meant to be, you know, like not everything's meant to be complete free. Like, there is an intention for this to be funded somehow, right? Where people aren't like
mm,
tin cupping. And I think that being upfront with that is useful. And so, that's
yeah,
something I would recommend because, in the beginning, you truly may not know what you need to keep, potentially close or even like build, to make money. But as long as you're kind of upfront, with the intention that like, hey, we have this cool open source project, but we also have this like cool company, and we do intend to make, a product out of this. And it's whether we're going to sell support, consulting services, a SaaS thing, like I think just being upfront about that is a
yeah,
lot. It just goes a lot better versus people going to your project and feel like, oh crap, like I'm forced to go pay, for this thing, because then it leads to, weird dynamics that even saw in the Terraform world where, sorry, HashiCorp world where, there were certain features that people wanted implemented in Vault, like multi-cluster and so on, that they were like, you'd have a end user, like a big bank would actually go implement the functionality, send a pull request, and they
right.
would be like,
Uh
sorry,
oh.
no. And I think in the beginning they were not very clear about that, but eventually they came a little bit more clear. But they definitely upset people. So I think the more you kind of be upfront, and I think sometimes it's okay to like say like, look, we actually don't like fully know. Like we're a startup, we're figuring stuff out. Like we want to go build this. We're VC funded,
Yeah.
or we're just bootstrapping. Like the more you're upfront about that, I think the better for your long term.
I totally agree with you. Yeah, I think one of the worst things that can happen is somebody spends weeks building a pull request. Weeks building some code. They submit it as a pull request, then it doesn't get accepted for some hidden reason.
Yeah, or
It's
just
like,
ignored. Like in this case, I think they said
or
this
just
thing and it
ignored.
was just ignored for like a few weeks, and
Yeah,
eventually
it's like,
they
yeah,
realized,
okay.
yeah. So, but yeah,
It's
it happens.
it seems like a lot of that then is cultural, because you mentioned Sid. I agree with you. I think one of the things I really admire about him and the way he ran GitLab was that kind of cultural spirit was throughout it, right? It was their handbook being completely open, like 2,000 pages in their handbook or whatever it was. But even, I always use this as an example, like back in 2017 or whatever it was, when there was a giant meltdown, someone engineer fat fingered an update and everything went down, and they spun up like a live Google Doc and started like basically debugging it with their community. They spun up like a live YouTube feed. And it strikes me that a huge chunk of this is that when you trust the founder or the people who are maintaining the project, then you're willing to give them a lot of leeway, right? Like and I agree with you. Like I think the honesty is everything. Like I think we see this in founders all the time when they're like I think one of the hardest elements in my mind of being a founder is you're iterating on your product with customers who've given you money, right? So like by definition, you have to improve out in the open. And it strikes me that when the founder is like, look, we're going to do the best we can to build the best possible product or company around this, and people trust that and it's authentic, then people give you a lot of forgiveness around that, right?
Totally. And this even the whole notion of like transparency builds trust is like not only
Yeah.
applicable to open source land, right? In proprietary land, when you'd have a bad security issue, like if you didn't have a public, like kind of blameless post-mortem or update on thing, like people would view you in a very, very, different light. I think people are very forgiving when you actually treat, your customers or community in kind of a open, honest way of like, hey, look, we're not perfect. We'll make mistakes. We'll be transparent about it and work to build the best thing. Because I think most humans understand that, like, humans are flawed, software is flawed. We're all gonna make
Yeah.
mistakes. And if you don't have that there, then you just kind of like, oh, maybe I'll go somewhere else or pick, another, vendor. I think this just transparency builds
Yeah.
trusting is very, very applicable
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
all
Yeah.
sorts
For
of
sure.
cases. And it's hard maybe for people that have not worked, like, we're basically, it's like, like the whole like elder millennial thing, or like,
Yeah.
it's like, we're kind of like, we've been around in open source for a long, time. It's probably like 25 plus years for me
Yeah.
now. And, we grew up in a very, very different, it's the,
Yeah.
open source, done in your parents' basement type of days.
Right.
It's now very, very different. And there's still a lot of people that, you know, haven't interacted. They've never built products, in an open way. They've never worked. And I think there's just a lot, I think that needs to be happen for people to kind of learn how to develop, this way, right? Like
Yeah.
it's just a very tough thing that not many companies out there or people learn, to be honest,
No.
unless you got lucky to work at like Canonical or Red Hat or
Right.
GitLab.
I
You
agree.
just
And
don't,
it's
yeah.
also it's super weird as well. Like I think sometimes in the open source world we think, yeah, this is kind of how you do communities and how you build things. Like outside of this world, it's really f***ing odd. Like what happens in the open source world in my mind. And I think sometimes we forget that when you get these companies who kind of come in and they're brand new and they're trying to figure out the base dynamics of all of this stuff, It's like
It's
yeah.
entertaining for me. And like in the early days, like I still remember one of my like early experiences in open source. I used to work on this project called, Eclipse, and
Oh
a
yeah.
very popular development environment for its time and in a Java heydays for sure.
It was the
And
OG. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
and we had these kind of fun, one of the OG kind of like corporate open source efforts, and you know, lots of quick feedback. You had hundreds of thousands, millions of folks using this thing. You make a small change. You're like, you know what? We're gonna go change, the tabs for files to like from square edges or rectangular edges to like beveled edges, and like you would basically get like hate mail and death threats on like news groups or forums, and like that level of feedback for me, that lesson was like, you know, yes, people could be mean, but like that quick feedback loop and value actually leads to better,
It does.
product and
Yeah.
software development. And I think people who aren't used to that and like used to very structured, like, oh, I'm going to go set up a customer advisory thing, like open source community will give you that
Yeah.
feedback so quickly. I love that. And I think
Yeah, I
every
do too.
founder out there benefits, from that.
I also think that sometimes people forget that level of like ferocious like feedback is a sign that people care and that they love what this project, they care about it deeply. A lot of their personal identity is laid into that as well. So and what I'm sure you've seen this as well. All too often when you meet those people in person, there's a very like a deeply respectful relationship there. It's just that
Yeah.
people communicate online in a very blunt and direct capacity. The one thing I was curious about your thoughts on though was
Yeah.
there's always been like a little bit in portions of the open source world a bit of an anti corporate
Establishment.
kind of
Yeah. Yep. Yep.
anti-establishment kind
Yep.
of mentality. Um, and I can imagine that with the CNCF, like you got to strike the right balance there. I mean, obviously, like this is a largely professionalized open source ecosystem. Like most of the members are like they're
Yeah.
companies, right, who are
Yep.
building things.
People are employed by these companies too. So
Right. But I'm sure you've seen patches of that happening. How have you navigated that? Like, because making money isn't a bug, right? But
yeah.
but running these the spirit of everything we've talked about today is you got to do it the right way. You got to do it in a way that's collaborative, right? How have you navigated the anti-corporate sentiment?
I mean, it's hard. I mean, generally, just data being open, it works a lot. We have annual reports that kind of show where our, money is being spent. We give so many people, like kind of scholarships and mentorship opportunities. So like just being open and transparent about that helps kind of educate people like, all right, you know, yes, there's, quite a bit of money involved because companies are funding this effort. And, anytime you host a 10, 12,000 person event, like those are not cheap things to
Yeah,
do. Like, it's like, and we don't have the benefit of being like an Amazon or Google that are putting on events for purely like keeping their customers happy and lead generation. So it's a loss center for, for them or
right.
for us. We need to break even. So like being a little bit more transparent with like how we're running, what we do, kind of helps a long way. I always think there'll be a subset of folks may just truly be kind of anti-establishment and kind of see us as like it's kind of funny where I won't name this person. I had a discussion where it's just like, we kind of see you like you're like a transformer that like your hand is Google, your leg is Amazon, your other guy. I'm like, dude, we're like a $50 million a year foundation. Like these are $1 trillion companies. Like like our whole the way you need to think about us is we're playing a game. Let's call it capitalism and building software with with this, right? And we're kind of like the referees to ensure that one company doesn't have like extra
Yeah,
people on the field or is violating the rules or someone has like a weapon on, like we're there to kind of ensure a level playing field, so like everyone kind of behaves. And on top of that, we're also trying to ensure that there's a job market. Like a lot of folks that actually like truly contribute to our projects, like code wise, or participate in our community and are not just like kind of voices on the side, they've seen the value of participating because they've been able to jump around to a variety of companies and improve their own compensation. Some of the stuff I'm most proud about in my role in CNCF is giving people career opportunities, changing their lives. They worked on a startup that got bought or their
yeah,
first job in the family. Like, that type of thing
it's amazing. It's
is
amazing.
awesome, and most people see that. I think you're always going to have the people that think you're like a transformer of the
Right.
Fortune 50 type thing, but the reality and data doesn't really show that way. We're really kind of referees that are trying to ensure a level playing field in
Yeah.
essentially pre open source days. You would be beholden to the largest, most powerful company that would maybe slap you around with their patent portfolio or
Yeah.
whatever advantage they have. And that's like an education and conversation you have to have with folks. And part of this job is like, yeah, I have a thick skin generally, and so like I don't mind when people, call me, like, oh, you're an idiot, or like it's an open source. Like, if you ever worked in a community, you know this world, Jono. It's like you're just used to just like hate mail, and like so having a conversation with someone face to face at an event or something else, and basically confronting your critics and having a good conversation works out well. Like there's just a lot more mutual respect and
Yeah.
understanding. It goes along. It goes along.
Yeah. Don't hate the don't hate the
Yeah,
player.
yeah.
Hate the
Look,
game.
I'm a referee, just trying to keep people, not sequestering their trademarks back, or
Right.
misusing certain intellectual property. Like we're truly there to kind of build a fair playing field for all
It's
participants.
And this is an area where I think you've done such an amazing job in your career, because it strikes me that a lot when you get some of that sentiment, there's like an ignorance. Like I've seen this with companies where to me, there's like three overlapping circles. You've got like a marketing team, you've got a sales team, and then you've got like a devrel or a community team. And fundamentally, these are all people who are tasked with going out and influencing large numbers of other people with different levels of responsibility. But to me, like the negative sentiment towards the salespeople is because the stereotype is the used car salesman from the 70s, which doesn't really exist anymore. The perception of the marketing team is, oh, they're just, all they want to care about is brand. The perception of the community of the DevRel people is they just want to go to conferences and get drunk and don't actually bring any money in for the company. And to me, it's like all of these perceptions are incorrect. Like if we weave these things together better, then you build a pretty efficient machine. And to me, that's one of the things that I've admired most about the work that you do is you cross cultures with organizations and the work that you do. And I think the CNCF, you and of course many other people, it's a testament to the work you guys do. So
no, it's definitely a fun job. It's never a slow day. It's almost kind of working. It's almost like working in an emergency room. Like it's just like, all right, what's the problem? Today. Yeah, exactly. All right, someone fall off a motorcycle, a shotgun move. It's like, we kind of have this. So the variety keeps it entertaining, and then also just like the privilege I have of like talking to like new companies, right? You'll have like startups that are doing cool things, but also like big companies. You'll have like a John Deere or a Schneider Electric that are just like kind of new to open source, right? And just kind of working with them, educating them, like that just is a joy, and it's kind of fun to do, because there's still so many companies out there that are still kind of learning the ropes, which is awesome.
Well,
and so,
hey man, I appreciate you taking the time. This is my version voyage in terms of maybe doing a few little interviews with folks. And I emailed you, and you were like immediately responded and said, "Yeah, sure, let's do it." And I appreciate you giving it a go. And it's always a pleasure hanging out with you, man.
These are always fun. Hoping you're doing this just to kind of get some of your ideas and bring on good people. And it's not like one of these like midlife crisis, I need a podcast type things.
No. My midlife crisis is happening in other ways.
Exactly. Yeah. I just love it, but always a pleasure. And hopefully we'll you always bump into kind of KubeCon, and just I always tell people like going to a modern open source conference. It could be KubeCon or all things open. Like just like go out and check these things out. Like you'd be very, very surprised of like what you would kind of learn. Especially if you're new to things or at an enterprise or just trying to figure stuff out. Like you'll learn a lot by actually being there.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. We at KubeCon in London, the last KubeCon. Erica, my wife, and I, we brought our son Jack, who's 12. I brought him to KubeCon on the first day, and I could tell it was like super inspiring for him. He walked around, and he was like, I'll never forget this. We were walking through, and he said, "Hey, Dad, you know what's so cool about this?" I was like, "What?" He said, "There's like 12,000 people just like me here," and like to hear a little kid say that, I was like, yeah, dude, that's exactly what it's all about. And whether you're 12 or whether you're 80, it doesn't really matter. Like it's such a cool environment, and meeting all these people, and it's inspiring, and you learn a lot. And
that's awesome.
Thanks for all the work you do, man. Thanks for coming on.
Awesome. Appreciate it.
Cheers,
awesome.
Chris.
Cheers.
Alrighty, friends. That was Chris. Thank you, Chris, for coming on and doing the interview. That was actually the first interview that we've done on the channel. I certainly had a good time doing it. And if you enjoyed it, then let us know down in the comments, because I'd love to see if we should do some more of these. Now, I know it sounds like a giant cliche, but I really would love if you could like and subscribe to the channel. It is amazing how much of a impact likes and subscribe have on little channels like mine. So that would be great. And before you go, We talked a lot in that interview with Chris about kind of how to engage with developers and how to build developer communities. And there's a lot of like pretty bad advice that gets trotted out that was valid 5 years ago, but really doesn't work anymore. If you go and check out this video next, I'm going to walk through a ton of these developer engagement tips that you should actually abandon and instead recommend the things that actually work today in 2025. So go check out that video next, and I'll see you there.